Panic tastes like cheap gin and copper. Nora had 2 seconds before her ex's fingers wrapped around her arm. 2 seconds to make the most reckless decision of her life. She threw herself into the shadowed VIP booth and dropped onto the lap of a stranger in a tailored suit. He didn't flinch. He didn't push her away. Instead, a heavy calloused hand rested on her waist and a voice like crushed gravel whispered against her neck, "Play along." Neon light bled through the condensation on the windows of the velvet room, casting fractured violet streaks across Nora's pale face. She kept her head down. Her fingers white-knuckled and trembling clamped around a cheap synthetic leather clutch that contained exactly $42, a dead cell phone, and a stolen tube of pepper spray. She breathed through her mouth. The air in the underground club was thick, layered with the scent of expensive perfume, spilled bourbon, and imported cigars. It coated her throat, making it hard to swallow. This was not her world. She was a woman who worked double shifts at a diner that smelled perpetually of grease and burnt coffee. She belonged on a crosstown bus, not hiding in the corner of a clandestine speakeasy where the cover charge was more than her weekly rent. But Cameron was out there. Just the thought of his name made the muscles in her neck lock up. Cameron Davis wasn't a monster who lurked in the dark. He was the monster who smiled at the cashier, held the door for the elderly, and charmed everyone in his orbit. He was handsome, ambitious, and utterly hollow. For 2 years, Nora had allowed that hollow space to suck her dry. He had systematically dismantled her life, isolating her from friends with quiet, reasonable-sounding concerns. He had drained her savings to fund his startups, leaving her drowning in credit card debt. When she finally found the courage to pack a single duffel bag and leave, she thought she had planned it perfectly. A cash-only bus ticket out of the city, a burner phone, but Cameron always found a way. He always knew. He had caught up to her at the terminal. She had seen his reflection in the glass of a vending machine, that easy, terrifyingly calm smile on his face as he scanned the crowd. She hadn't thought. She had just run. Down the slick, rain-soaked pavement into the nearest alley and straight through the heavy brass doors of the velvet room, slipping past a distracted bouncer. Now she was trapped. Nora pressed her back against the cool velvet wall of a darkened alcove near the restrooms. The thumping bass of the club's sound system vibrated through the floorboards, rattling her teeth. She risked a glance around the room. The clientele here wore bespoke suits and dresses that looked like liquid silk. They drank from crystal tumblers and spoke in hushed, confident tones. Then she saw him. Cameron had made it inside. He was standing near the coat check, casually unbuttoning his damp trench coat. His hair was slicked back, perfect as always. He wasn't frantic. He didn't look like a man hunting down a terrified woman. He looked like a man looking for a misplaced wallet. That was the most terrifying thing about him, the absolute certainty that she belonged to him. He began moving through the crowd. His eyes, cold and analytical, scanned the booths, the bar, the dance floor. He was checking the exits. He was checking the shadows. Nora felt a cold sweat break out along her spine. Her chest tightened, restricting her lungs. If he caught her here, he wouldn't make a scene. He would simply take her arm, smile apologetically to anyone watching, and whisper something in her ear. Something about how crazy she was acting, how she needed to come home and take her medication. And people would believe him. They always did. Then he would pull her into a cab, take her back to that suffocating apartment, and the real punishment would begin. She couldn't go back. She would rather die than go back. Her eyes darted frantically around the club. The main exit was blocked by Cameron's slow, methodical advance. The service doors were guarded by men with earpieces. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, except for the elevated section at the back of the room. It was a raised VIP area cordoned off by a thick velvet rope. 2 massive men in dark, conservative suits stood at either end of the steps. The booth itself was deeply recessed, shrouded in shadows, but she could make out a few figures sitting in the curved leather seating. It was the only place in the club Cameron couldn't casually stroll into. It was an island of restricted access. Cameron was 20 FT away. He paused, asking a waitress a question. The waitress pointed towards the restrooms, towards Nora. Time slowed down to a crawl. The bass dropped out of the music, replaced by a high, ringing tone in Nora's ears. She had to move. Now, she didn't formulate a plan. Plans were for people who had options. Nora only had instinct. She pushed off the wall, keeping a large pillar between herself and Cameron's line of sight, and practically threw herself toward the VIP section. She moved before conscious thought could catch up with her survival instinct. The 2 guards at the base of the VIP steps were distracted dealing with an intoxicated patron who was drunkenly demanding entry. Nora didn't hesitate. She ducked her head, slid past the large man's right shoulder, and scrambled up the 3 carpeted steps. The air up here was different, colder, quieter. The frantic energy of the club faded, replaced by an atmosphere of heavy, oppressive stillness. There were 4 men in the booth. 3 of them were standing spaced evenly around the perimeter. They weren't drinking, they weren't talking, they were just watching. In the center of the plush semicircular leather sofa sat a single man. He was nursing a glass of amber liquid, his posture relaxed, almost bored. He wore a dark tailored suit that fit him with predatory precision. His dark hair was brushed back, revealing sharp angular features and a jawline that looked carved from granite. He emanated an aura of absolute authority. This was not a man who visited clubs to have fun. This was a man who owned the room, the building, and probably the block it sat on. Nora's entrance broke the silence. The three standing men immediately moved their hands, dipping inside their jackets. She didn't stop. If she stopped, she was dead. She could feel Cameron's presence behind her, sense the exact moment his eyes found her back. She had run out of runway. Nora threw herself across the short distance, lunging straight for the man in the center of the sofa. She dropped onto his lap. The impact was jarring. He was solid, unyielding. It felt like sitting on a block of warm iron. Nora grabbed the lapels of his suit jacket to steady herself. Her breathing ragged, her eyes wide with sheer panic. She smelled cedar, expensive tobacco, and the distinct metallic tang of gun oil. For a fraction of a second, the world stood completely still. The man did not flinch. He didn't startle, didn't spill a drop of his drink, didn't even blink. His dark eyes, devoid of any discernible emotion, locked onto hers. They were cold, empty. The eyes of a man who evaluated everything in terms of assets and liabilities. Around them, the booth erupted into silent, lethal action. The three guards closed in, pulling weapons from their holsters, their faces masks of pure aggression. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, waiting to be violently ripped away and thrown to the floor. She waited for the shouting. It never came. A single, subtle movement from the man she was sitting on, a slight raise of 2 fingers from the hand holding the glass, and the guards froze. They didn't holster their weapons, but they stopped their advance, hovering like coiled springs just inches away. Nora opened her eyes, her chest heaving. She looked down at the man. Then a heavy, calloused hand settled on her left hip. It wasn't a caress. It was a clamp, a physical anchor locking her into place. Nora. The voice cut through the ambient noise of the club like a razor blade. Nora flinched violently, pressing herself closer against the stranger's chest. She turned her head just enough to see the stairs. Cameron was standing at the base of the VIP steps. The polite, charming mask had completely vanished. His face was mottled with red, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. His eyes were wide, manic, completely unhinged. He had finally lost control. Get up. Cameron snarled, taking a step towards the stairs. Get up right now, Nora. Stop making a scene. He took another step. The 2 guards at the bottom of the stairs, having dealt with the drunk, finally realized what was happening. They turned, stepping in front of Cameron, forming a solid wall of muscle and hostility. Excuse me, Cameron said, trying to regain his composure, pasting a rigid, awful smile on his face. That's my girlfriend. She's had too much to drink. I need to take her home. The guards didn't speak. They didn't move. They just stared at him with blank, dead eyes. Look. Cameron snapped, his patience fraying. He tried to push past the guard on the left. I said she's coming with me. The guard didn't shove him. He simply shifted his weight, catching Cameron in the chest with a forearm as thick as a tree trunk, stopping his momentum entirely. The guard's other hand rested casually on the bulge beneath his suit jacket. Cameron froze. He wasn't a stupid man. He was a bully, and bullies understood power dynamics better than anyone. He looked at the guards at the stairs. Then he looked past them into the booth. He looked at the 3 men standing with their hands inside their coats. Finally, his eyes landed on the man sitting on the sofa. The man whose lap his girlfriend was currently occupying. The stranger hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. He simply sat there, his hand firmly gripping Nora's hip, his dark eyes fixed on Cameron. There was no anger in his gaze, no posturing, just a flat, terrifying indifference. It was the look of a man looking at a cockroach he was deciding whether or not to step on. Cameron swallowed hard. The manic energy drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, stark realization of exactly where he was and who he was looking at. The blood left his face. His jaw worked silently for a moment. He took a slow step back, then another. Fine, Cameron muttered, his voice barely audible over the music. He pointed a trembling finger at Nora. You're dead to me. You hear me. Don't ever come back. It was a hollow threat, a desperate attempt to salvage a shred of dignity. He turned on his heel and practically fled towards the exit, pushing his way through the crowd until the heavy brass doors swallowed him whole. He was gone. Nora slumped, the last of her adrenaline suddenly evaporating. Her muscles turned to water. She let her head fall against the stranger's shoulder, dragging in a shuddering breath. She had done it. She had survived. The relief was so intense, it made her dizzy. Are you finished? The voice rumbled against her chest, deep and resonant. It wasn't loud, but it commanded absolute attention. Nora stiffened. She had almost forgotten where she was. She slowly pulled her head back, looking into the dark, impassive face of the man beneath her. Yes, she whispered, her voice cracking. Thank you, I'm sorry. I just needed. She placed her hands on his shoulders, intending to push herself up and slide off his lap. The hand on her hip tightened. His fingers dug into the soft flesh above her waistline, pressing through the thin fabric of her dress. It was a clear, undeniable restraint. Nora froze, her heart kicking back into a frantic rhythm. She looked into his eyes, searching for a trace of the polite gentleman who had just saved her. She didn't find one. He leaned in slightly. His lips hovered mere inches from her ear. When he spoke, his voice was like crushed gravel, completely devoid of warmth. Play along. Nora stopped breathing. The instruction wasn't a suggestion. It was a command delivered with the casual certainty of a man who was never disobeyed. She remained perfectly still, perched on the edge of his thighs, her hands awkwardly hovering above his shoulders. The man tilted his head, slightly keeping his gaze fixed on the entrance where Cameron had just disappeared. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. Relax your shoulders. He murmured, his breath warm against her jaw. You're as stiff as a corpse. If you're going to use me as a prop, at least make it look convincing. Nora forced her muscles to uncoil. She lowered her hands, resting them lightly on his chest. Beneath the crisp cotton of his shirt, she could feel the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart. It was infuriatingly calm. He's gone. Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. She tried again to shift her weight, to pull away. You can let me go now. The hand on her hip didn't budge. If anything, his thumb stroked a slow, deliberate line against her side, sending a sharp jolt of awareness through her nervous system. He's gone, the man agreed, his tone conversational. But my guards are currently wondering why I haven't ordered them to drag you into the alley and break your legs for breaching my perimeter. It's a valid question. I'm currently searching for an answer. Nora's stomach plummeted. She looked up at the three men flanking the booth. They were no longer focused on the stairs. Their eyes were locked on her, cold and expectant. They were waiting for an order. I was desperate. Nora said, the words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic whisper. She looked back at the stranger, studying the hard lines of his face. He, the man who just left, he was going to hurt me. I didn't have anywhere else to go. I just saw the ropes and thought you would leverage my reputation to scare off a domestic nuisance. He finished for her, his dark eyes finally shifting to meet hers. You calculated that your pathetic little stalker wouldn't have the stomach to start a fight with my security. You used my table as a shield. I didn't know who you were. Nora lied. It was a weak lie. She didn't know his name, but anyone with basic survival instincts knew what kind of man occupied the center booth at the Velvet Room with 4 armed guards. The corner of his mouth twitched in a mirthless half-smile. Don't lie to me. It's insulting to both of us. You knew exactly what you were jumping into. You just decided the monster in the dark was a better bet than the monster you knew. He set his glass down on the low glass table in front of them. The sound was a sharp clack that made Nora flinch. You're right, she admitted, her voice trembling. The fight was leaving her. She was exhausted, drained by the terror of the past 3 hours. I used you, I'm sorry. I don't have any money, but I promise I'll walk out of here right now, and you'll never see me again. She tried one last time to pull away. The grip on her hip became bruising. You brought your garbage to my table, he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a quiet, dangerous rumble. You disrupted my business. You compromised my security, and you did it by throwing yourself into my lap in front of half the city's underworld. He leaned in closer. The scent of him, dark, masculine, and violent, filled her senses. In my world, he whispered, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear, sanctuary isn't free. You don't get to use me as a human shield and simply walk away because the immediate threat is gone. Nora swallowed hard, her mouth completely dry. What do you want from me? I told you I don't have anything. You have exactly what you brought to this table, he replied, pulling back just enough to look her in the eyes. His gaze was analytical, dissecting her, tearing away her defenses layer by layer. He took in the cheap dress, the frayed clutch, the desperate exhaustion in her eyes. You have yourself. Panic different from the frantic terror Cameron inspired began to pool in her gut. This was a cold, calculating dread. She had traded a chaotic abuser for a professional predator. I'm not a prostitute. She spat, a sudden flare of anger momentarily overriding her fear. The man actually laughed. It was a short, harsh sound that held no humor. If I wanted a prostitute, I would buy one. He said dismissively, I have no interest in your body, but you owe me a debt for the service I just provided. You made a public spectacle of claiming my protection. Now people are going to assume you belong to me. I don't belong to anyone, Nora said fiercely, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her bravado. You do now, he stated as simply as if he were stating the weather. He finally released her hip, moving his hand to gesture towards the stairs. You can stand up now, but if you walk out those doors alone, your ex-boyfriend is waiting across the street. He didn't leave. He's standing by the subway entrance watching the exit. Nora's blood ran cold. She snapped her head toward the front of the club, straining to see through the frosted glass. She couldn't see anything, but she knew deep in her bones that the man was telling the truth. Cameron never gave up that easily. He was waiting for her to lose her protection. How do you know? She asked, her voice hollow. Because men like that are predictable, he said, picking up his glass again. They are cowards who feed on weakness. He knows you have nowhere else to go. He's waiting for you to realize it. Nora slumped back down onto his lap, the fight completely draining out of her. She stared at the glass table, feeling the suffocating weight of the trap closing around her. She was caught between a man who wanted to destroy her mind and a man who could destroy her life. So the stranger said, his voice settling into a smooth, businesslike cadence. Here is your reality. You can leave and deal with him, or you can stay. You can walk out of here on my arm, you will get into my car, you will sleep in one of my guest rooms. For the foreseeable future, you will play the role you started tonight. Nora looked at him, her chest tight. Why, what do you get out of this? I get leverage, he said simply. I get a useful distraction, and I get the satisfaction of knowing you owe me a debt you can never repay. He extended his hand toward her. It was a large, capable hand, scarred across the knuckles, an invitation into the abyss. My name is Vincent, he said softly. Make your choice. Nora stared at the offered hand. It was large, the skin over the knuckles pale and lightly scarred. Taking it meant stepping off a cliff in the dark, but staying meant Cameron. She placed her trembling fingers in his palm. Vincent's grip was firm, locking around her hand with a chilling finality. He stood, pulling her up with him in one fluid, powerful motion. Walk close to me, Vincent said, his tone low and conversational. Keep your head up. If you look like a victim, you become one. He didn't wait for her to process the instruction. He stepped past the low glass table, and his security details seamlessly reorganized around them. Two massive men took the lead, carving a clear path through the crowded club floor. Nora forced her chin up. Her knees felt like water, but the iron grip on her hand anchored her to the ground. The heavy thudding bass of the club's music seemed muted, now drowned out by the roaring in her own ears. Patrons stepped aside. They didn't just move, they actively shrank away from Vincent's orbit. Nora felt the physical weight of their stares. They looked at her with a toxic mix of curiosity, envy, and raw fear. She was the new accessory on the arm of a man who clearly dictated who breathed the air in this room. They reached the heavy brass doors. A guard shoved them open, and the cold, damp city air hit Nora's face. It smelled of wet asphalt, cheap street food, and stale exhaust fumes. A sleek, armored black SUV idled precisely at the curb. Before she stepped towards the vehicle, Vincent squeezed her hand, subtly forcing her to pause on the wet sidewalk, across the street. He murmured, his face angled away from her, pretending to look towards the idling car. Don't stare, just look. Nora glanced past the blacked-out windows of the SUV towards the glowing entrance of the subway station 50 yards down the block. Cameron was leaning against a damp brick wall under a flickering street lamp. The collar of his trench coat was turned up against the drizzle. He was smoking a cigarette, his eyes fixed intensely on the club's exit. The exact moment he saw her, he pushed off the wall, stepping into the light. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She instinctively stepped backward, her shoulder colliding with Vincent's solid chest. Hold your ground, Vincent commanded quietly. There was no panic in his voice, only the flat cadence of absolute control. Cameron took 2 aggressive steps forward, then stopped dead. He finally registered the men surrounding her. He saw the black armored SUV, and he saw Vincent's arm resting casually, possessively on the curve of Nora's waist. The streetlights caught the hardened, impassive faces of the security detail. Cameron's cigarette dropped from his fingers, hissing as it hit a puddle on the pavement. He didn't look furious anymore. He looked incredibly small. The reality of the situation visibly crashed down on him. He wasn't dealing with an isolated waitress he could bully into a cab. He was looking at a machine that could crush him out of existence without leaving a paper trail. He took a slow step back into the shadows of the subway awning, turning his face away and melting into the dark. A strange, hollow sensation bloomed in Nora's chest. For 2 years, that man had been the epicenter of her terror. He had convinced her he was omnipotent, that his reach was infinite. Now, completely neutralized by the mere presence of the stranger beside her, Cameron just looked pathetic. Get in, Vincent said, pulling open the heavy rear door of the SUV. Nora climbed into the cavernous backseat. It smelled of rich leather and ozone. Vincent slid in beside her, pulling the heavy door shut. The thick click of the latch sounded exactly like a vault ceiling shut. The ambient noise of the city vanished entirely, leaving a heavy, pressurized silence. The driver pulled away from the curb before Vincent even bothered to fasten his seatbelt. Nora sat perfectly stiff, pressing her shoulder against the door panel, putting as much physical space between them as the vehicle allowed. Vincent didn't seem to care or notice. He opened a small compartment built into the center console, retrieved a slim, secure tablet, and began reading. The glowing screen illuminated the harsh, unforgiving angles of his face. He looked completely detached, as if the past 20 minutes had been nothing more than a minor administrative delay in his schedule. Where are we going? Nora asked. Her voice sounded thin and reedy in the quiet, sterile air of the car. My house, Vincent replied, not lifting his eyes from the screen. You said I was going to be a distraction. She pressed her anxiety-demanding parameters. She needed to understand the exact dimensions of the cage she had just walked into. A useful distraction. What does that actually mean? Vincent sighed, a brief exhale of mild annoyance. He tapped the screen of his tablet, turning it black, and turned his head to look at her. In the dim light of the passing street lamps, his expression was unreadable. I have a highly sensitive business arrangement finalizing over the next month, Vincent explained, his tone strictly clinical. It involves individuals who are exceptionally paranoid. They are currently looking for any sign of weakness, instability, or hidden motives on my end. They expect me to operate like a machine. And I make you look human, Nora deduced, the deep cynicism of her life bleeding through her exhaustion. Vincent offered a short, humorless smile. You make me look occupied. A man distracted by a sudden, intense obsession is a man who isn't currently plotting to murder his business partners. You provide a highly visible narrative. They will focus their energy on you trying to figure out what leverage you hold over me, while I quietly dismantle their infrastructure from the other side. Nora swallowed hard. You're using me as bait. I am using you as misdirection. Vincent corrected smoothly. Bait implies I intend to let them catch you. I assure you, Nora, no one touches my property. The word property hung in the cold, conditioned air between them. It wasn't delivered as an insult. It was simply a statement of operational fact. She had traded her agency for a heavily armed escort. She turned her head, watching the neon blur of the city gradually give way to the quieter, darker, and vastly wealthier streets of the outer suburbs. She had survived the night. But the cost was terrifyingly absolute. Iron gates parted silently as the SUV approached, revealing a long, winding driveway flanked by perfectly manicured pines. The estate was massive, a sprawling modern fortress constructed of glass, steel, and dark, unyielding stone. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a high-end corporate headquarters or a very expensive private rehabilitation clinic. The vehicle came to a smooth halt under a wide, brilliantly lit portico. A man in a dark suit opened Nora's door before she could even reach for the handle. She stepped out onto the pristine paving stones, shivering as the damp night air clung to her bare arms. Vincent walked past her without a word, heading straight toward the heavy double doors of the main entrance. Nora hesitated for a fraction of a second before following his broad shoulders. She had $40 and nowhere else to go. The interior was just as unforgiving as the exterior. The foyer was a vast, echoing expanse of polished gray marble and recessed minimalist lighting. There were no photographs on the console tables, no artwork on the walls, no scattered shoes or keys, no signs that a human being actually lived and breathed in this space. Arthur, Vincent called out. An older man, impeccably dressed in a tailored vest and dark trousers, emerged from a side hallway. He had a severe, lined face but intelligent, unnervingly calm eyes. Sir, Arthur said, his gaze briefly flicking to Nora to assess her before returning to his employer. Show her to the east guest room. Vincent instructed, slipping out of his suit jacket and handing it to the older man without looking. Have someone fetch whatever she needs from the city tomorrow. She arrived with nothing. Very good, sir, Arthur replied. Vincent turned back to Nora. He looked deeply exhausted. The adrenaline of the evening had finally worn off, leaving behind a cold, pragmatic shell of a man. Go with Arthur. Vincent said, lock the door if it makes you feel better. I don't particularly care. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp, we will have breakfast and I will outline exactly what I expect from you in public. He didn't wait for a response or a nod of understanding. He simply turned and walked up the sweeping central staircase, disappearing into the heavy shadows of the second floor. Nora stood frozen in the middle of the massive foyer. Her fingers tightened around her cheap clutch until her joints ached. She felt absurdly out of place, a piece of street debris blown into a museum. If you will follow me, miss, Arthur said gently. His voice lacked the terrifying, absolute coldness of his boss. She followed him down a long, dimly lit corridor, her worn sneakers squeaking faintly against the perfect marble. Arthur pushed open a heavy oak door at the end of the hall and stepped aside, gesturing politely for her to enter. The room was immense. A massive king-sized bed dominated the space covered in pristine, tightly tucked white linens. A seating area with 2 leather armchairs sat perfectly squared in front of a modern gas fireplace. Floor to ceiling, windows offered a view of the dark, sprawling grounds and the tree line beyond. It was objectively beautiful but completely sterile. It was a luxury hotel room meant for an extended business stay, not a place to heal. There is a full bathroom attached, Arthur said, pointing toward a partially open door. Fresh towels are in the cabinet. If you require anything to sleep in tonight, I can procure a clean shirt from the laundry. A shirt would be fine, Nora mumbled, wrapping her arms tightly around her ribs. Thank you. Arthur nodded and stepped out into the hall. He returned a moment later, handing her a folded crisp cotton t-shirt. Good night, miss, he said, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The brass lock clicked with a heavy, definitive thud. Nora stood perfectly still for a long time. The silence of the house was absolute and heavy. There were no sirens wailing in the distance, no shouting neighbors through thin drywall, no heavy footsteps pacing the floorboards above her. For 2 long years, Cameron had meticulously conditioned her to live in a state of constant humming anxiety. She was wired to listen for the aggressive turn of a key in the lock, the sudden change in his breathing, the violent slam of a kitchen cupboard. Here, there was nothing to listen to. She walked slowly to the edge of the bed and sat down. The high-end mattress barely gave way beneath her weight. She dropped her clutch onto the floor and buried her face in her hands. The dam finally broke. She didn't sob loudly. It was a silent, agonizing release of built-up pressure. Her shoulders shook violently as the reality of the last 4 hours completely washed over her. She had almost been dragged back to that apartment. She had almost lost the tiny, desperate sliver of freedom she had clawed back. To keep it, she had sold herself to a man who looked at her like a depreciating asset on a spreadsheet. She stood up, stripping off her cheap, damp dress. She threw it into a corner of the room, hating the smell of the nightclub and the stale sweat that clung to the synthetic fabric. She pulled on the oversized cotton shirt Arthur had given her. It smelled strongly of expensive detergent and rigid starch. Nora walked into the bathroom. The lights flickered on automatically stark and brutally bright. She leaned over the massive marble vanity, bracing her hands on the cool stone, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. There were bruised, dark circles under her eyes. Her hair was a tangled, damp mess. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman running for her life who had slammed into a brick wall. Vincent had said she was a distraction, misdirection. She was a simple pawn in a violent game she didn't even know the rules to. But as she splashed freezing water on her face, a tiny, hard knot of resolve began to form in the center of her chest. Cameron broke her down because she loved him. She had handed him the power to hurt her because she genuinely believed in the charming man he pretended to be. Vincent was a monster, and he didn't waste energy pretending otherwise. He was brutally honest about his ruthless nature and his expectations. There was no love here to be exploited. There was no trust to be betrayed. It was a transaction. He needed a prop. She needed a fortress. She walked back over to the heavy bedroom door. She reached for the brass deadbolt, her fingers brushing the cold metal. She paused. Locking the door wouldn't keep Vincent out if he decided he wanted to come in. This was his house, his rules, his cage. The lock was just an illusion of safety, a pacifier for the weak. Nora dropped her hand, turning away from the door and leaving it unlocked. She climbed into the massive bed, pulling the thick, heavy duvet up to her chin. She stared blindly at the dark ceiling, listening to the suffocating, expensive silence of the estate. She was terrified. But for the very first time in 2 years, she knew exactly what she was dealing with. She closed her eyes, preparing her mind for tomorrow's performance. Morning arrived not with birdsong, but with the harsh mechanical whir of the automated blackout blinds rising. Nora squinted against the sudden influx of pale morning light. She hadn't actually slept. She had hovered in a state of suspended animation, listening to the vast, quiet house, waiting for a threat that never materialized. She threw off the heavy duvet and walked into the massive bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face, dragged a brush through her tangled hair, and put her cheap dress back on. The synthetic fabric felt gritty against her skin. It smelled faintly of stale club air and panic. She hated it, but it was all she owned. Downstairs, the house was equally silent. She found her way to the dining room by following the sharp, bitter scent of espresso. Vincent sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing a landscape of faded ink and faint white scars. A tablet and 3 dark, encrypted phones were arranged with geometric precision next to his coffee cup. He didn't look up when she hovered in the doorway. "Sit," he commanded, tapping a line on his screen. Nora walked to the chair immediately to his right and sat down. Arthur materialized from a side door, setting a plate of eggs and toast in front of her along with a cup of black coffee. He poured it without asking how she took it, then vanished just as quietly. "Eat," Vincent said. "You look completely hollow. A stiff breeze would snap you in half, and that doesn't fit the narrative I'm paying for." Nora picked up a fork, pushing the eggs around the porcelain plate. "I'm not hungry. I didn't ask about your appetite. Eat the food." He finally looked up from his tablet, his dark eyes locking onto hers. They were sharp, analytical, and entirely unsympathetic. "We have a highly compressed timeline, Nora. By 8 o'clock tonight, half the city needs to believe you are the singular blinding weakness in my otherwise perfect armor." She took a forced bite of the toast. It tasted like ash. "How do we do that? By creating a very specific visual," Vincent explained, setting his tablet face down. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a terrifying lack of emotion. "Men in my line of work do not acquire sudden messy attachments to waitresses with stalkers. We calculate, we leverage, we acquire assets. For me to suddenly bring a woman like you into my inner circle, bypass my security protocols, and house you in my private residence implies an obsession that defies logic. And your enemies will try to use that obsession against you. Exactly. A faint cold smile touched the corner of his mouth. My associates are currently finalizing a massive logistics merger. They are looking for a reason to cut me out of my share. They will spend the next 3 weeks obsessing over you, investigating your background, looking for the angle. They will waste their resources trying to find out why I care about you, why I quietly dismantle their entire supply chain. Nora swallowed the dry bread. The reality of the situation was a heavy weight on her chest. She wasn't just a prop, she was a lightning rod. What happens if they figure out it's a lie? What happens if they realize you don't actually care what happens to me? Vincent leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished wood. The distance between them vanished. They won't, because you are going to be perfect. He reached across the table, his large hand wrapping around her jaw. His fingers were warm, rough, and uncompromising. He didn't squeeze, but the grip was absolute. He tilted her head slightly, forcing her to maintain eye contact. When we are in public, you will not cower. He instructed, his voice dropping to a low, resonant gravel. You will not flinch. You will look at me as if I am the only fixed point in your universe. When I touch you, you will lean into it. You will wear the clothes I provide, you will speak when spoken to, and you will project absolute, unwavering confidence. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She was terrified of him, but she was more terrified of the man standing on the street corner. And if I do all that, if you do all that, I keep you alive, Vincent said simply. He released her jaw, his hand retreating to his coffee cup. And when the deal closes in 30 days, I will give you a new identity, a healthy bank account, and a one-way ticket to any city in the world. You will never see your ex-boyfriend again. You will never see me again. 30 days. A month of playing a lethal game of pretend. She looked at the encrypted phones on the table, at the heavy armored glass of the dining room windows. Cameron was a chaotic, emotional terrorist. Vincent was a machine. She knew how to survive a machine. You follow the rules. Fine, Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. 30 days, but I need one thing from you. Vincent raised an eyebrow. You are not in a position to negotiate. I am if you want this to work, she counted, surprising herself. A tiny spark of defiance ignited in her chest. I won't be kept in the dark. If I'm going to be sitting in a room with men who want to kill you, I need to know who they are. I need names. I need faces. I can't act like I belong in your world if I'm constantly terrified of asking the wrong question. Silence stretched across the table. Vincent stared at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. For a long, tense moment, she thought he might throw her out right then and there. Then he tapped the screen of his tablet, waking it up. He slid it across the mahogany table until it rested next to her untouched plate of eggs. A grid of 6 faces stared back at her. Men in expensive suits with hard, unforgiving eyes. Memorize them. Vincent ordered, picking up his coffee. Starting with Leo Carmine, we're having dinner with him tonight. Clothes began arriving at noon. Arthur ushered a team of 3 tight-lipped women into Nora's bedroom. They didn't speak to her, didn't ask about her preferences, and didn't offer polite small talk. They moved with military efficiency, unzipping thick matte black garment bags and laying out a highly curated arsenal of silk, cashmere, and structured wool. This wasn't a makeover. It was a tactical outfitting. They dressed her in a charcoal gray slip dress that clung to her ribs and fell perfectly to her mid-calf. It was simple, completely unadorned, but the weight of the silk and the precision of the cut screamed impossible wealth. They clasped a delicate, painfully heavy diamond tennis bracelet around her left wrist. It felt like a handcuff. A pair of sharp black stilettos completed the uniform. When they finally left, Nora stood in front of the full-length mirror. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. The exhausted, terrified waitress in the cheap synthetic dress was gone. In her place stood a sleek, polished asset. She looked expensive, she looked untouchable. A sharp knock broke her concentration. Vincent opened the door without waiting for a reply. He was dressed in a dark navy suit that fit him like a second skin, a subtle departure from the stark black he wore the night before. He stopped in the doorway, his dark eyes sweeping over her from the tips of her shoes to the crown of her head. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a compliment. He simply assessed the work. It passes, he said finally. He checked a heavy silver watch on his wrist. Car is waiting. Remember the brief? Leo is paranoid, talks too much, and looks for micro-expressions. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes on me. They walked out to the idling SUV in silence. The drive back into the city felt entirely different from the frantic escape of the previous night. Nora sat rigidly against the leather seat, staring at the blurred city lights. She felt like a soldier heading into a drop zone. The restaurant was a deeply exclusive, dimly lit establishment nestled in the financial district. There were no windows, only heavy velvet curtains and mahogany paneling. The air smelled of roasted bone marrow and $2,000 wine. Vincent didn't wait for the maitre d'. He bypassed the host's stand entirely, placing his hand firmly on the small of Nora's back. The touch sent a jolt of electricity straight up her spine. It wasn't a gentle guiding pressure. It was heavy, proprietary, and absolute. He was branding her in front of the entire room. He steered her toward a large circular booth in the deepest corner of the restaurant. 2 men were already seated. One was a massive scarred guard who immediately stood up and stepped away from the table. The other man remained seated. Leo Carmine looked exactly like his dossier photo, but the flat image hadn't captured his chaotic nervous energy. He was a man in his late 50s wearing a flashy maroon suit. He had quick darting eyes and a smile that didn't reach his forehead. "Vincent," Leo boomed, spreading his arms wide though he made no move to stand. "Punctual as always. It's annoying, honestly, makes the rest of us look bad." "Leo," Vincent replied smoothly, his tone flat. Vincent pulled out a chair for Nora. As she sat, he let his hand drag slowly across her bare shoulder. The friction of his calloused thumb against her skin was painfully deliberate. He took the seat next to her, pulling his chair unnecessarily close so their thighs pressed together under the table. Leo's darting eyes immediately locked onto Nora. He stopped smiling. The chaotic energy vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating scrutiny. He looked at the silk dress, the diamond bracelet, and the way Vincent's arm rested casually across the back of her chair. "Well," Leo murmured, leaning forward slightly. "This is new. You didn't mention you were bringing a guest, Vincent." "You usually prefer to do business in the dark." "Plans change," Vincent said, motioning for the waiter. "Nora, this is Leo Carmine, a business associate." Nora forced her heart rate to slow down. She remembered Vincent's instructions. Project absolute confidence. Look at him like he's the only fixed point. She didn't offer her hand to Leo. She gave him a slow, dismissive nod, then immediately turned her face back to Vincent, offering a small, incredibly private smile. Vincent caught the look. For a fraction of a second, surprise flickered in the depths of his dark eyes. He hadn't expected her to be a good actress. He recovered instantly, his gaze darkening as he returned the smile with a look of heavy, possessive intent. He reached under the table, his large hand clamping down on her bare thigh. Nora gasped quietly, the sound muffled by the ambient noise of the restaurant. His fingers dug into her muscle, a stark reminder of the reality beneath the performance. He was establishing dominance, ensuring Leo saw exactly who held the reins. "A pleasure, Nora," Leo said, his voice slick with false charm. He didn't look at her face. He looked at Vincent's hand on her chair. "You must be someone very special. Vincent here is famous for his detachments. I've known him for 5 years, and I don't think I've ever seen him share a cab, let alone a dinner table. I like to keep my private life private, Leo," Vincent said smoothly, picking up the wine list. "Until I find something worth showing off." His thumb stroked a slow, agonizingly deliberate circle on Nora's thigh under the table. Her breath hitched. She shifted her weight, leaning her shoulder against his chest. She was acting, playing the role of the devoted, obsessed lover. But the heat radiating from his body, the absolute confidence in his posture, the dangerous power he exuded, it wasn't a prop. It was real. Cameron used to control her by making her feel invisible, by systematically stripping away her worth until she believed she was nothing without him. Vincent controlled her by dragging her into the spotlight, draping her in armor, and daring the world to look at her. As the waiter approached the table, Nora realized a terrifying truth. She was terrified of the men sitting across from her. She was terrified of the guns hidden under their jackets. But sitting here, pressed against the side of a lethal predator who had claimed her as his own, she felt completely, undeniably safe. Day 29 arrived with a low, bruised sky and a relentless drizzle that turned the city streets into slick, black mirrors. Nora stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Vincent's penthouse office, watching the traffic crawl across the bridge below. She wore a tailored ivory suit today, the fabric heavy and warm against the chill of the glass. The diamond bracelet was still clamped around her wrist. Over the past month, it had stopped feeling like a handcuff and started feeling like a warning label to the rest of the world. She had learned the rhythm of this violent ecosystem. She knew when to lower her eyes, when to hold a stare, and how to pour a drink for a man who casually ordered the destruction of a competitor's warehouse between bites of steak. She had become an extension of Vincent's impenetrable facade. Tonight was the final signature. The merger was closing at a private reception in the financial district. "You're standing in the open." Vincent's voice broke the quiet hum of the climate control. Nora didn't jump. She simply turned around. He was leaning against the heavy oak frame of the doorway, watching her. His tie was undone, draped loosely around his neck, and exhaustion lined the sharp angles of his face. The past month had been a brutal chess match, and he had played it flawlessly. "I was watching the cars," Nora said, her voice steady. She closed the distance between them, stopping just a foot away. "Are we ready?" "Leo is desperate," Vincent replied, his dark eyes tracking her movements. "His margins are bleeding. I squeezed his supply chain over the weekend, and he knows I'm pushing him out of the final contract. He will try to make a play tonight. It will be messy." Nora held his gaze. 30 days ago, those words would have sent her spiraling into a panic attack. Now she simply felt a cold, hard knot of anticipation. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Vincent reached out his knuckles, brushing lightly against the lapel of her ivory jacket. It was a rare, completely uncalculated touch. "Stay visible. Stay close to Arthur. If Leo approaches you, let him speak. He wants to find the crack in the armor. Give him nothing." Hours later, the reception hummed with low conversations and the clinking of crystal. It was a room filled with predators disguised in bespoke tuxedos. Nora stood near a towering ice sculpture, nursing a club soda flanked by Arthur and another silent guard. Vincent was across the room, flanked by lawyers finalizing the destruction of Leo's empire on paper. Beautiful night for a hostile takeover. Leo Carmine materialized from the crowd, a scotch in his hand and a slick, nervous sheen of sweat on his forehead. He ignored Arthur's immediate shift in posture and stopped right in front of Nora. The chaotic energy he possessed at that first dinner was gone, replaced by a dark, frantic malice. Nora didn't take a step back. She took a slow sip of her drink, projecting absolute boredom. "Leo, you look tired." His jaw tightened. "Vincent plays a deep game, I'll give him that. He used you well. A pretty little distraction while he ripped the copper out of my walls." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper. "But I do my homework, Nora. It took some digging, but I found out where you came from. I found the diner. I found the debt." He paused, waiting for her to break, waiting for the terrified waitress to surface. She just stared at him. "I also found a very angry, very pathetic man named Cameron." Leo continued, a vicious smile stretching across his face. "He was more than happy to talk, told me all about how fragile you are, how easy you break. He's sitting in a car 3 blocks from here. I told him that once the ink dries tonight, Vincent's protection contract expires. I told him where to wait." A cold spike of adrenaline hit Nora's chest. Cameron, the ghost from her past life summoned by the devil in her current one. Leo was using her trauma as a crude, blunt instrument, hoping to rattle her enough to make Vincent stumble. Nora looked at Leo's sweating face. She thought about the 2 years of hiding bruises. She thought about the $40 in her cheap clutch. Then she thought about the cold, absolute certainty of the man standing across the room. She smiled. "It was a terrible, freezing thing. You made a mistake, Leo," Nora said, her voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous register she didn't know she possessed. Leo frowned. "Excuse me, you think Cameron is my weakness?" she stated, stepping slightly closer to the older man, forcing him to look down into her eyes. "Cameron is a cockroach. You dug through the trash and brought a pest to a gunfight. If you think bringing that pathetic coward into my orbit is going to make me flinch, you drastically underestimate exactly who I belong to." She saw the exact moment the realization hit him. He wasn't looking at a terrified prop. He was looking at a woman who had fully assimilated into the violence of her surroundings. A heavy hand settled onto Nora's lower back. The warmth radiated through the silk lining of her suit. "Is there a problem here, Leo?" Vincent asked. His voice was quiet, but the ambient noise around them seemed to instantly die. Leo took a rapid step back, his eyes darting between Vincent and Nora, just making conversation, congratulating the lady. "The deal is signed," Vincent said smoothly, his hand pulling Nora flush against his side. "You have 24 hours to clear out of the harbor facilities. If I see your face in my city after tomorrow, I won't bother with lawyers." Leo swallowed hard, his face pale. He looked at Nora one last time, seeing the absolute unyielding wall of their combined front before turning and disappearing into the crowd. Nora exhaled a slow, shaky breath. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving her muscles trembling. "He found Cameron," she whispered, leaning her weight against Vincent. "He said he's waiting outside." "I know," Vincent said calmly, steering her toward the exit. "My security detail picked him 20 minutes ago. He is currently having a very educational conversation in the back of a soundproof van. He will be on a cargo ship to Jakarta by midnight. You will never hear his name again." Nora stopped walking. She looked up at Vincent, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He hadn't just used her as misdirection. He had actively hunted down her nightmare and erased it. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. Vincent looked down at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the dim light of the corridor. "Because no one threatens what is mine. Let's go home." Morning light poured through the massive windows of the estate, casting long, stark shadows across the marble foyer. Nora sat at the long mahogany dining table. She wore her own clothes, a simple pair of jeans and a gray sweater Arthur had sourced for her. The tailored suits, the silk dresses, and the heavy diamond bracelet were neatly folded and boxed in the guest room. The 30 days were up. Vincent walked into the room. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark slacks and a simple black Henley, his sleeves pushed up. He carried a thick manila envelope and dropped it onto the polished wood directly in front of her. "As agreed," Vincent said, pulling out the chair opposite her and sitting down. "A new passport, a sterilized identity, banking details for an offshore account with enough capital to live very comfortably anywhere in Europe or South America, and a plane ticket for a private charter leaving at noon. Nora stared at the heavy envelope. It was everything she had desperately prayed for a month ago: absolute freedom, a clean slate. The monster from her past was gone, and the predator who saved her was honoring his contract. She placed her hands flat on the table. They weren't shaking. "You played your part flawlessly," Vincent continued, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. He was back to being the machine. "Leo is neutralized. The merger is secure. My partners are satisfied with the illusion. You are free to go." Nora looked up from the envelope. She studied the harsh lines of his face, the shadows under his eyes, the absolute stillness of his posture. For 30 days, she had slept down the hall from a man who commanded a violent empire. She had sat in rooms with killers and thieves. Yet, looking at the door, she realized she had never felt safer in her entire life. Cameron had promised her love and given her a cage of terror. Vincent had promised her a cage and given her an impenetrable fortress. He hadn't asked her to shrink. He had forced her to stand up, draped her in armor, and taught her how to look a threat in the eye without blinking. "Arthur is waiting outside with the car," Vincent said, breaking the silence. He stood up, turning his back to her to look out the window. It was a dismissal. The transaction was complete. Nora didn't touch the envelope. She pushed her chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floor. She stood up and walked around the long table. She stopped directly behind him. He was a mountain of a man carrying the weight of a vicious world on his shoulders. "I don't want to go to Europe," Nora said quietly. Vincent stiffened. He didn't turn around. "The money is clean. You can go wherever you want. I want to go anywhere." He finally turned, his dark eyes narrowing as he looked down at her. "The contract is over, Nora. The performance is done. There is no one left to hide from." "I know," she said, holding his gaze. She took a step closer, breaching his perimeter. "I'm not hiding anymore. I'm choosing." Vincent stared at her, the clinical detachment in his eyes cracking just a fraction. He looked at her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "This is not a safe world. I am not a good man. I don't need a good man," Nora replied, her voice steady and absolute. "I need the man who kept me alive. I need the man who taught me how to fight back." She closed the final inches between them. She didn't hesitate. She reached out, placing her hands flat against his solid chest, feeling the heavy, rhythmic thud of his heart. She pushed herself up onto her toes, sliding her arms around his neck. Vincent let out a rough, ragged breath. His massive hands came up, gripping her waist with that familiar, bruising intensity. He didn't push her away. He pulled her flush against his body, anchoring her to him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck. The scent of cedar and gun oil wrapped around her entirely, comforting. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't crushed gravel. It was a quiet, desperate admission. "Stay." Did Nora make the right choice trading one dangerous life for another? Or is survival just about finding a monster who fights for you? If this dark, grounded journey kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let the algorithm know. Share this story with someone who loves a truly gritty romance, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more intense, immersive audio fiction every week. Drop a comment below. Would you have taken the envelope or stayed?